Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Atrophy of Soul, and welcome to my top 10 games of 2015. 2015 has been one of the more difficult years in recent memory for me to properly critique, due in large part to a wide variety of high-profile game releases that seem to fail at living up to my expectations. Just about every highly praised game release of the year was encumbered by deeply ingrained design flaws that were particularly difficult for me to look past due to how effectively they hindered the excellence that these titles attempted to achieve. The most important facet of a video game for me is the core gameplay and how well the developers were able to implement design philosophies that allow for deeply rewarding mechanical complexity. This isn't to say that games with impressive narratives aren't enjoyable for me to play through, but it is to say that a game with fun gameplay can stand on its own merits in spite of its narrative structure. If a title has been highly praised for its world building or complex themes, yet has interwoven these poignant ideas with gameplay systems that fail to engage players properly, consequently, from my perspective, the title has failed at being an excellent video game and shouldn't be considered for my list. Suffice it to say, I haven't played every single game that was released in 2015, so as confident as I am in my list, there may have been titles that I missed out on which won't be included here. Also, this is a list of games that I myself found to be the most rewarding, engrossing, and fun in 2015. There isn't an exact science to how these titles have been arranged besides through my own personal preferences and the enjoyment that these titles elicited for me specifically. I'm keenly aware of the failings of each and every one of these titles, but in my opinion, what they did well was more than enough to sustain my enjoyment for hours on end. Moreover, to comment further upon 2015 in gaming, the overt unwillingness to examine the complex structure of video games is something that has continued to perpetuate in 2015, with the games media continuing to demonstrate that they are woefully inadequate at reviewing video games. This failure to examine a particular work in its totality has made me feel as though individuals with the idea that 2015 was somehow some sort of keystone year in gaming history are woefully naive at best, and hopelessly delusional at worst. This isn't to say that 2015 didn't receive its fair share of amazing games, as I wouldn't have been able to so lovingly construct a top 10 list if it hadn't. However, with rare exception, 2015 wasn't a year where boundaries were pushed and the medium took evolutionary steps forward. In fact, it's quite the contrary. 2015 was safe and almost by the numbers, but oddly enough, I wouldn't say that this is at all a bad thing. Quite frankly, some of the most enthralling, engaging, and addictive titles of 2015 were merely re-releases or indie games such as Resident Evil Remake, Devil May Cry 4 Special Edition, Rare Replay, Axiom Verge, and Ori and the Blind Forest. What 2015 lacked in polish and development and more than made up for in ambition and heart, and I'm hoping that I've done a sufficient enough job outlining why it is that I feel that this year has been so interesting, and why these particular experiences made such a positive impression on me as the year comes to a close. There seems to have been a concerted effort from game developers to create titles that truly push the power of the underwhelming 8th console generation with exclusives and experiences that finally worked in giving this generation some sort of identity of its own. This is the first year since the release of the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One that I can genuinely say that those of you who didn't own one of these consoles in 2015 were truly missing out on some of the year's greatest experiences. While I'm glad to see that the 8th gen is finally beginning to hit its stride, it is deeply concerning that it has taken us 3 years to get to a place that previous console generations only needed a few months to achieve. The sheer lack of unique software for these machines up until this point has been an absolute detriment that will hopefully continue to be remedied in 2016 and onward. Now that my little rant is over, I'd like to preface my list by disclosing some of the caveats I placed upon myself when constructing this video. Just like every year, HD remixes, re-releases, rehashes, whatever you want to call them, were not to be included as a part of this list, because in my view, including games that were already released in the past goes against the idea of a list of the best games of 2015. Devil May Cry 4 and Resident Evil Remake were repackaged and re-released in 2015, but they aren't games of 2015 by my logic and won't be treated as such. As usual, handheld titles will not be included as a part of the top 10 proper. This is not to say that there weren't handheld games worthy of being a part of this list. However, for the sake of concision, I'd like to keep handheld games as a part of their own subcategory separate from console and PC releases. Nonetheless, for anyone interested, my top 3 handheld games of the year will be outlined during the credits of this video, so be sure to check that out if you're interested. Now, without further ado, Here are my choices. By expertly placing players directly into the role of level designer, Mario Maker has become one of the most surprisingly addictive, pertinent, and deeply rewarding game releases of all time. Mario Maker gives players access to many of the design elements that allow game developers to create, manipulate, and warp game mechanics to create the engrossing and addictive experiences that the Mario franchise is so well known and loved for. Allowing players to freely create their own maps, levels, and experiences brilliantly achieves two things in tandem. Firstly, being able to construct your very own Mario levels fulfills a deeply ingrained need that many of us old school fans of the franchise had been yearning for since we were children. Secondly, it perfectly delineates the consistent brilliance that the level designers at Nintendo have exhibited in the countless Mario games released over the years. Creating even a single level that is as fun, challenging, and creative as the classic games in the Mario franchise is quite the task to undertake, and may give you a newly found respect for level designers who are quite frankly taken for granted in the gaming industry. As you continue to experiment with Mario Maker, you will come to learn that great level design is organic and cohesive in a way that gives players a sense of direction without being overtly obtuse. It's didactic yet subdued, engaging yet challenging, and is consistently interesting and fun. Mario Maker makes you think about video games from an entirely new perspective and gives you the tools to make your dreams a reality. Players can experiment with a wide variety of assets from Mario's various 2D adventures, and are allowed to choose from 4 different Mario motifs, each with their own unique style, physics, and enemy variants that make for an extensive palette for creativity to run wild. Even though the game does an excellent job at teaching and providing players with the tools needed to create varied and interesting levels, many of the more hardcore fans of the Mario franchise will notice various elements missing from the list of tools that the game allows you to experiment with. For example, players aren't allowed to use curved structures, which were heavily utilized in Super Mario Bros. 3, allowing Mario to slide down hills and climb up slopes. The game is also lacking in any significant content of its own, as it primarily uses user-generated levels to sustain the experience, and while this isn't necessarily a detriment, it does mean that the game's quality is contingent on the player base itself, which was quite a gamble to take on Nintendo's part. Since user-generated levels range in quality, your experience with the game's various maps will vary significantly from day to day. Don't be surprised to find yourself playing through myriads of levels that are overtly uninspired, frustrating, or downright terrible from time to time. However, the emphasis on player creations also means that Mario Maker will be a title that you will be able to come back to for years to come. With a strong community of players consistently creating imaginative and entertaining levels, it's hard not to recommend Mario Maker to anyone with a fondness for 2D platformers, the minutiae of level design, or the excellent standard of quality that the Mario franchise has consistently exhibited since its inception. What is likely to be the most controversial and surprising game on this list, Call of Duty Black Ops 3 is the greatest game in a franchise that has been attenuating in quality since the release of the excellently constructed Modern Warfare 2. By taking all of the best elements from Call of Duty's past and homogenizing them with various elements from competing franchises such as Crysis, Deus Ex Human Revolution, and even Halo, Black Ops 3 has successfully created one of the most genuinely fun, exciting, and addictive first-person shooters of the year. An overwhelming focus on player choice can be found in every facet of Black Ops 3's design philosophy, as players are allowed to customize their characters, weapons, abilities, genders, and even armor. The introduction of exosuits from last year's Advanced Warfare has been expertly built upon in Black Ops 3 by allowing players to fine-tune their playstyles in various ways pace, which can make each enemy encounter fresh and interesting. The various abilities that the exosuits add to the core game mechanics is exciting and inventive, allowing players to customize their areas of expertise with interesting abilities such as hacking, immolation, invisibility, quick dashing, double jumping, wall running, and myriads of other skills that can be customized and leveled to make the player character a far more agile and efficient killer. With the addition of both online and local co-op for all of its game modes, Black Ops 3 offers a vast array of content ranging from an extensive campaign which can last around 12 to 15 hours, Nightmare Mode, which is a completely remixed version of the campaign with a brand new storyline involving the spread of a viral outbreak, Zombies Mode, which is a wave-based shooter that forces players to overcome onslaughts of progressively more ruthless and powerful monsters, Dead Ops, a retro-inspired top-down arcade shooter that is fully featured with its own set of power-ups, maps, and bosses, and lastly, the local or online multiplayer mode, which introduces character classes, all with their own unique abilities and specializations that make for an interesting and fast-paced experience that many players may have a tough time putting down. While Black Ops 3 does an excellent job at delivering a wealth of content to players with some deeply rewarding and tight game mechanics, the level design in the campaign mode can be somewhat inconsistent by sometimes relying upon infinite waves of enemies, making some of the levels feel cheap and artificial as a result. The split screen in Black Ops 3 also has its fair share of technical issues involving cropped off backgrounds, strange loading screens, almost unintelligible in-game text, and some menu glitches which can be somewhat frustrating. The main campaign story can also be tough to follow if you aren't particularly invested in the narrative. The game's finale is quite interesting and thought-provoking, but the path leading up to that point may be muddled and incoherent to some who are more so interested in the core gameplay than the clumsily constructed plot. Even with its various flaws, Black Ops 3 is an excellent first-person shooter which manages to take the refined game mechanics of the Call of Duty franchise and expand upon them in novel and interesting ways that will consistently surprise you. Don't let the iterative nature of the Call of Duty franchise put you off from Black Ops 3. It's an excellent game that can stand on its own as one of the best games that the genre has ever seen, and easily stands amongst the greatest games that the franchise has produced in recent memory. Somehow, year after year, Nintendo has consistently created the greatest platforming titles in the history of video games, and even after decades of being in this industry, they continue to impress me with some of the most masterfully crafted, unique, and heartwarming experiences ever conceived. Continuing this trend of absolute excellence is the fun, inventive, and genuinely beautiful Yoshi's Woolly World, a platformer that is as endearing and timeless as it is challenging and engaging. This is a title that will easily stand the test of time due to its gorgeous art style alone. Every facet of the game world looks as though it's been carefully handcrafted, and has taken advantage of this alluring art style by allowing Yoshi himself to be placed into unique and surprising scenarios that completely subvert genre traditions through smart and sagacious level design. Since the evil Kamek decided to invade Yoshi's island to unspool all of its inhabitants for Baby Bowser's benefit, the surviving Yoshis are tasked with reconstructing their friends who now exist as bundles of yarn strewn about each of the game's various levels and worlds. Each level contains 5 pieces of yarn that, if successfully acquired, will allow Yoshi to bring his friends back to life. Doing so doesn't only increase the game's completion percentage, but also allows players to play as the Yoshi they've managed to rescue, allowing for a wide variety of Yoshi to choose from. Each of the Yoshis have a unique skin pattern that reflect the level that they were found in, and while some of the Yoshi are more endearing than others, the game does an excellent job at incentivizing the collection of these wool pieces by making players feel as though they're slowly piecing together the beautiful world that was stolen from these cute little wool creatures at the beginning of the game. In spite of its endearing art design, Yoshi's Woolly World is quite the challenge to undertake. Collecting all of the pieces of yarn, sunflowers, and stamps in each level is no easy task, especially in the later half of the game where the maps force players to masterfully implement each of Yoshi's unique abilities in order to overcome the challenges that the game tasks you with completing. Even with the challenge presented, the game never feels cheap or unforgiving. Whenever you do fail, it's almost always your fault unless you're playing the game's fun yet hectic co-op mode, which may cause you and your partner to awkwardly hinder one another from time to time. Yoshi's Woolly World also implements Nintendo's amiibos, which are used to allow players to unlock brand new skins for Yoshi based upon the amiibo in question. Just about every amiibo is compatible in Yoshi's Woolly World, from Samus Aran to Mega Man and even Sonic the Hedgehog, and while these extra skins don't endow Yoshi with brand new abilities to experiment with, they are a fun extra that won't make players who don't own these amiibo feel as though they are missing out on any sort of significant content. If you decided to dismiss Yoshi's Woolly World solely based upon its excellently crafted art design or child-friendly presentation, then you are doing yourself a great disservice. Yoshi's Woolly World is one of the most challenging, unique, and inspired platformers ever made, and truly does, much like The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker, epitomize the idea that excellent art design can make for a timeless classic. A team-based third-person shooter created by the imaginative designers at Nintendo, Splatoon takes this exceedingly popular genre, dismantles and dissects it before rebuilding it in a way that only Nintendo can. Instead of forcing players to compete for the best kill-to-death ratio like most modern shooters of the era, Splatoon instead tasks players with using various weapons and items to paint environments in their team's color. The team who most effectively covers the majority of the game world with their paint after a set duration of time wins the game. This paint can also be used to destroy other players and even works as a secondary means of traversal, allowing players to use their paint to stealthily traverse portions of environments satiated with their team's colors. Many of the primary weapons featured in Splatoon resemble the armaments found in most other shooters, with weapons that range from machine guns, sniper rifles, and shotguns. However, it is the way that Splatoon has successfully redefined how these weapons are used that makes for an entirely novel and exhilarating experience. Since the object of the game is to cover the most ground possible with your paint, accuracy and precision may not be as important as weapon spread and firing rate. Killing players of the opposing team, while advantageous, isn't the primary objective of Splatoon's multiplayer modes, so you may find yourself weighing various options in a completely different manner than you would in any other shooter. On the most fundamental level, Splatoon is a game of tug-of-war. There is a consistent struggle between players as they spread their ink and destroy one another assiduously in an effort to color the environment in their team's shade of victory. While Splatoon's online multiplayer modes are addictive and deeply rewarding, the single-player campaign should not be overlooked as it contains some of the most impressive aspects of the entire experience. The mode is structured much more like a platformer with third-person shooting mechanics, but with a unique spin on things. The campaign doesn't focus on diverse weaponry to sustain its experience like most other shooters tend to, but instead tasks players with traversing challenging maps replete with various puzzles and enemies that must be circumvented with the use of the ink gun. Since the ink that players use to destroy enemies can also be used as a means of traversal, the game places players into scenarios that effectively expand upon the idea of the third-person shooter while retaining a sense of identity of its own. Even the game's numerous boss battles are constructed as puzzles that players must solve, and the final boss of the game is one of the most interesting yet complex and challenging battles that you are likely to ever experience in a shooter. It isn't often that Nintendo creates brand new IPs, especially in a genre that has been so heavily saturated. Splatoon may be a third-person shooter at its core, but it takes genre traditions and redefines them in such a way so as to create a title that is wholly exceptional, overwhelmingly captivating, and entirely fun to its core. The follow-up to 2013's competent yet disappointing reboot of the iconic Tomb Raider franchise, Rise of the Tomb Raider somehow manages to take the most substantial game mechanics from the original game and meld them with many of the distinctive aspects of the classic franchise to create a title that is everything that the original should have been, whilst creating a fresh experience in the process. Unlike its progenitor, Rise of the Tomb Raider isn't an origin story, so Laura more closely reflects the heroine that fans have grown to know and love, Many of the more over-the-top and sadistic facets of the reboot have been subdued here, as there aren't any situations where Laura is being masochistically battered in order for the game to exude some sort of artificial grit. And while Laura definitely escapes from some particularly perilous situations in this game, there isn't much here that will shatter your suspension of disbelief like in the original. Of course, one of the primary criticisms leveled at the Tomb Raider reboot was the fact that there was a distinct lack of not only tombs, but puzzles. The Tomb Raider franchise has been known for placing players into foreign and esoteric environments that required an inquisitive mind to overcome. The games were entirely unforgiving and made no qualms with making sure that players understood that one wrong move could be their last. The original games did an excellent job at placing players into the role of a character who was smart, agile, and courageous, and with every mistake that you made, you were placed one step further into Laura's shoes, exhibiting her very expertise by cautiously evading traps, discovering artifacts, and uncovering mysteries. It is through this sense of discovery that Rise of the Tomb Raider adequately returns the series to its roots by allowing players to explore actual tombs that are satiated in treacherous hazards and interesting puzzles. In spite of its admirable attempts to inject elements from the franchise's past, there is no question that this game is indeed a follow-up to 2013's reboot, retaining that game's focus on set-piece-driven action segments that many longtime fans of the franchise may be put off by, in spite of how much more masterfully implemented they are in this iteration. All of the third-person shooting mechanics and abilities from the prior entry have been retained and expanded upon in varied and interesting ways, which help in making Laura feel like a judicious predator, able to survive even the most dire of circumstances through fortitude and vigor. Just about every tool that you will come across in Rise of the Tomb Raider can be upgraded in a multitude of ways, including Laura herself. The game consistently places Laura into dire scenarios that are thrilling and diverse, whilst completely avoiding the failings of its predecessor. Rise of the Tomb Raider is an impressive experience, easily worthy of the veneration that the series managed to achieve over the years, and while there is still plenty of room for improvement, there is definitely a sense here that the developers understood where they failed with the 2013 reboot, and have gone to great lengths to remedy their oversights. If you own an Xbox One, Rise of the Tomb Raider is definitely a must-have. It's likely the best game to release on the console this year, and is likely the best Tomb Raider title to release since Tomb Raider Anniversary. What is supposedly the final entry into the stellar Arkham franchise, Batman Arkham Knight concludes the series with a satisfying and intricately constructed bang that has players joining the Dark Knight for one final crusade to save Gotham City. Arkham Knight has been the subject of various controversies since its release, ranging from its $40 season pass to complaints about a campaign which focuses too much on the Batmobile, and a completely botched PC port which to this day has yet to be completely ameliorated by Rocksteady and WB Games. It may be difficult to discern how anyone could praise this iteration in the franchise when it's so overtly flawed and encumbered by business practices that are downright pernicious to consumers. In spite of the controversy surrounding the game, Arkham Knight as an experience is one of the most visually impressive, layered, and enjoyable titles that I've had the experience of playing through, and is easily one of the greatest superhero video games ever made. Building upon the layered yet accessible mechanics introduced in both Arkham Asylum and City, Arkham Knight takes everything that worked about the previous installments and expands upon them in new and unique ways. From allowing Batman to carry out instant stealth takedowns, to giving him the ability to finally drive the Batmobile, to even allowing him to team up with various characters during combat scenarios, Arkham Knight gives players just about everything that they wanted from a Batman experience, and has perhaps done so to the game's overall detriment. Since the ability to drive around in the Batmobile is by far the most unique element introduced into Arkham Knight, the game places a particular focus on the driving mechanics that, while ostensibly fun in short bursts, can cause the experience to feel somewhat bogged down in simplistic and repetitive scenarios that can feel much more like filler than deeply engrossing and enjoyable challenges to overcome. Very much akin to Arkham City before it, this is an issue that plagues the majority of Arkham Knight's side quests, as players are tasked with repeating the same exact objectives 4 to 5 times before the quest can be completed, and the overt lack of boss battles in Arkham Knight make many of the side quests feel anticlimactic and underdeveloped as a result. Even though Arkham Knight's side activities can feel overwhelmingly lacking, it is the game's main campaign that truly makes this an experience worthy of the Dark Knight himself. With varied locales, some truly surprising and unapologetic plot twists, and an amazing soundtrack, Arkham Knight is perhaps the perfect way for the story of the Batman to conclude. The open world that Rocksteady Studios successfully realized in Arkham Knight is impressive not only in scope, but design. Gotham City is a true sight to behold, whether you're speeding down the city streets in the Batmobile, or gliding through the skies as the Batman himself. The overall art design on display takes the very best qualities of Batman's history and infuses them to create what is perhaps my favorite open world ever constructed in a video game. The gadgets and abilities that Batman gains access to over the course of the experience expand upon the already abundant repertoire of actions and attacks that he had in the prior Arkham games, yet the developers still somehow managed to add brand new items to the mix, giving Batman the largest assortment of options possible for any given situation. Even though Arkham Knight is a deeply flawed video game, the overall reverence that it has for the Batman and the extensive ways that it expands upon the already massively constructed mechanics introduced in the prior Arkham games makes Arkham Knight a conclusion very much worthy of the prestigious legacy that the franchise has garnered since its inception. Even with some of the more lackadaisically implemented mechanics introduced, the overall quality of Arkham Knight cannot be denied as long as you aren't playing on the PC. With an extensive, surprising, and exciting campaign mode, as well as a wealth of post-game content including challenge maps, races, side quests, and a new game plus, Arkham Knight is a title that does an excellent job of concluding the story of the greatest superhero of all time. Platinum Games continues their record of excellence with the release of Transformers Devastation, a masterfully crafted hack-and-slash title that perfectly melds all of the best elements of Platinum's prestigious legacy into one stylish experience that is deeply engrossing and an absolute joy to play through. What's most impressive about Devastation is how easily accessible it is whilst containing layers and layers of depth that may go unnoticed by many. Being able to transform and quickly roam combat arenas in the midst of mass melees makes the gameplay feel fast, frenetic, and exciting. Each of the playable Autobots come equipped with unique abilities and attributes. Experimenting with the multiple combat styles adds even more depth and variety to an already deceptively intricate game, as each of their transformations, ultimate techniques, and vehicle attacks are unique and interesting. There's plenty in the way of content to keep players busy. In addition to the various secrets, characters to play as, and leveling of weapons and items, Devastation also features a challenge mode with various combat scenarios to overcome. These challenges feature some of the most difficult and heart-pounding situations found in the entire game, even going so far as to allow players to face the Autobots themselves in a massive gauntlet. The challenges and higher difficulties in Devastation are unforgiving and will put your combat mastery to the test. However, unlike other games within the genre, the difficulty spike doesn't only occur because of an increase of more dangerous enemies and attack speeds, but also due to the fact that Devastation demands that you master its core mechanics before allowing you to progress. There's plenty here for players to experiment with, and if you're particularly fond of this kind of gameplay, you can easily sink around 60 hours into Devastation just by leveling up, completing challenges, and creating more powerful weapons and items for Autobots to equip themselves with. I won't say much more about Devastation because I have an entire video devoted to it which can be seen here, but with fast-paced action, layered mechanics, fun characters, and an excellent soundtrack, Transformers Devastation will definitely reinvigorate your love for the iconic robots in disguise. Something I've attempted to convey to all of my subscribers over the years is the idea that gameplay is the primary and most important facet of video games as an artistic medium. The notion of an individual being able to experience an idea by interacting with a virtual world is one that is relatively original and innovative due to the fact that it makes the player a substantial component of the world that's being depicted. Communicating an idea through a set of mechanics is difficult on its own. However, from my perspective, a video game that truly pushes the medium forward is one that marries player perception, game mechanics, and narrative in such a way so as to allow these three elements to work in unison to create an experience that couldn't be achieved through any other artistic medium. If I were constructing this list not based upon personal preference or subjective enjoyment, but instead solely based upon the evolution of the medium, then game developer Toby Fox's Undertale will be at the very top of this list, perfectly homogenizing not only player choice, but the player themselves with a deeply touching narrative that is as humorous and lighthearted as it is dark and macabre. Undertale is a masterfully crafted title that successfully exemplifies the very best that video games are capable of. By not only implementing game mechanics as a way to immerse players into a deeply complex and intriguing world, but also by using them as a means to subvert player expectation by holding those mechanics against them, Undertale admirably explores the very idea of video games in a way that is deep and thoughtful without feeling pretentious and convoluted. With art design that's heavily influenced by old school RPGs of the NES and SNES eras of gaming, Undertale may come across ostensibly as a simplistic and somewhat derivative game that is merely pandering to players for the sake of nostalgia. However, once you begin playing through Undertale, you will notice within the first 5 minutes that this is a game that is unlike any other. There is a heavy emotional weight that is achieved from the outset due to excellent writing and authentic characters who are diverse and charming. By taking the mechanics of a turn-based RPG and infusing them with elements of bullet hell shooters and platformers, the battle system in Undertale is a unique pastiche that somehow evolves beyond the mechanics that it pays homage to by allowing players to completely avoid every encounter that they are presented with. Players are actually given the option to talk to enemies during encounters, which can work as a means of passively getting through battles, and depending on whether or not you decide on sparing or slaughtering the inhabitants of Undertale's world, the story will change drastically. Everything from the character dialogue to how creatures animate, and even the integrity of the game world itself will transform based solely on your decisions and actions throughout the experience. The game will consistently comment upon your actions and make you question why it is that you've decided to do what you've done, not only from a moral standpoint, but also from a player-driven one. Undertale consistently breaks the fourth wall in unique and interesting ways that would make Metal Gear creator Hideo Kojima proud, and effortlessly constructs a tale that is heart-wrenching and beautiful in one of the most poignant and meaningful ways that has ever been constructed in video games. I deliberately tried to avoid giving away too much of what Undertale consists of so that you can experience the game for yourself. Undertale is a title that is so enriching and beautiful that it must be experienced firsthand. It is a game that will remain with you long after you've completed it, and will truly impress you by using the medium in ways you may never have thought possible. The struggle to survive has always been the driving force behind the Resident Evil franchise, from its humble beginnings on the PlayStation 1 to its more bombastic and highly stylized iterations on the 7th gen consoles. RE is a series that has somehow managed to stand the test of time in spite of its various missteps over the years. While the franchise has been given new life with the re-release of Resident Evil Remake, which is regarded as one of the most technically impressive, frightening, and masterfully crafted entries in the series, it is the often overlooked Resident Evil Revelations 2 that has successfully breathed new life into the franchise by not only reinstituting elements from Resident Evil's past, but also in its implementation of brand new mechanics that truly makes it one of the best games in the franchise since the release of the excellent Lost in Nightmare scenario featured in Resident Evil 5. Since RE5's release, the franchise has consistently included some sort of co-op functionality that many hardcore fans have found to be intrusive and detrimental to what is supposed to be a survival horror experience. Since both of the player characters were able to build vast repertoires of weapons and items, the threat of imposing monsters and enemies deteriorated as players gained more and more control over the situations that they were placed in. By taking Resident Evil Zero's character switching mechanic and expanding upon it by creating characters who play distinctly from one another, Revelations 2 creates a much more subdued, yet concentrated experience that is tense and exciting, and almost infinitely replayable. Each of the returning series veterans, Claire Redfield and Barry Burton respectively, can wield projectile weapons, combine herbs, and combat the undead with a level of expertise that is fitting of characters who have been able to survive in this universe for so long. However, the two new playable characters, Moira Burton and Natalia Korja, are more passive in their gameplay and are primarily used for puzzle solving, locating items, and traversing environments. It is this dynamic between the player characters that allows Revelations 2's co-op gameplay to feel much more refined and useful than any of the prior games in the series. Having two characters at your disposal at all times never makes you feel as though you are overpowered, as the enemies in Revelations 2 are imposing and powerful, oftentimes forcing you to simply evade them for fear of losing progress and wasting precious resources. Each of the characters are also equipped with an inventory that is useful for carrying ammunition, herbs, key items, bandages, and materials to create explosives, molotovs, and decoys which can be used to attract and dispose of the myriads of enemies and monsters throughout the game. Item management has once again become a key component of the experience, and while it isn't as crucial as it was in the classic franchise, it is balanced just enough to successfully create tension in an already exhilarating title. Revelations 2 also features an assortment of modes that make the game infinitely replayable, from Countdown mode, which tasks players with completing the campaign within a time limit, to Invisible mode, a difficulty harkening back to Resident Evil Remake, which makes all of the monsters completely invisible, to the higher difficulties, which reward players with brand new weapons, items, and unlocks upon completion, and Raid mode, which could be a standalone experience in its own right, featuring an assortment of challenges which take place in a variety of locales from Revelations 1, 2, and Resident Evil 6. Raid mode works very much like an expansion of the Mercenaries modes found in the older titles in the series, which task players with slaughtering hordes of monsters within a time limit. There are various unlockables, weapons, and challenges that Raid mode tasks players with completing. Each of the characters can be leveled with use, and the mode can be played in local or online co-op. While the episodic format of Revelations 2 can be seen as a detriment to the overall quality of the experience, it is this subdued approach that has allowed the developers to create a title that is intimate, tense, fun, and invigorating. After putting around 170 hours into this game, I can say that Resident Evil Revelations 2 is plainly one of the best RE games ever made, and has me truly excited for what Capcom has in store for the series in the future. Hidetaka Miyazaki, the creator of the excellent Soul series, has once again triumphantly crafted a game that works not merely as an excellent piece of art that can stand on its own as one of the greatest experiences that the medium has to offer, but also as a deeply engrossing, complex, and intricately woven adventure that is cerebral, unnerving, and captivating. Heavily influenced by classic horror narratives ranging from Bram Stoker's Dracula to H.P. Lovecraft's Call of Cthulhu, the masterfully crafted Bloodborne is a dark fantasy action RPG which takes the framework that the Soul series has built and heavily distorts it to create a title that is as challenging and exciting as it is horrifying and disturbing. Upon mysteriously awakening in the twisted city of Yharnam during the Night of the Hunt, players are tasked with acquiring the Pale Blood and finding the source of a plague wreaking havoc upon the world which has forced reality to warp into some sort of hellish nightmare. The player character's search for the Pale Blood will give rise to countless questions and mysteries that Miyazaki games tend to be saturated in. There exists a deeply complex and intricately woven narrative and lore that the game presents to players very subtly. It is rare when Bloodborne overtly delineates its intentions to players, as piecing together the narrative is one of the most significant and satisfying portions of the experience. Speculating about the various nuances of the characters, monsters, and environments helps in making the world that the developers have presented feel much more authentic and impressive than most other titles in the medium. While the excellent art direction, environments, and narrative are deeply layered and alluring, it is Bloodborne's core set of mechanics that will keep players engrossed for hours on end. Very much like the rest of the Soul series, Bloodborne is challenging yet fair. The game respects the integrity of its player base by implicitly guiding players through its admirably crafted maps without overtly forcing players through didactic tutorial sequences or cluttering the screen with various button prompts, waypoints, and text that completely works at destroying immersion. Each enemy encounter is visceral and challenging. Enemy behavior is always chaotic and aggressive, leading to a much more offensive-based combat system than the prior titles in the Soul series, which rewards players for acting with tenacity, concision, and haste. There isn't a legitimate means of defense in Bloodborne, as shields are few and far between, and tend to be ineffective against the mercurial hordes of monsters who will stop at nothing to tear you limb from limb. Somehow, in spite of being an action title, Bloodborne has an atmosphere that can put even the greatest survival horror games to shame. With plague-ridden streets, a melancholic soundtrack, and somber locales, the developers were able to truly craft a world which expertly portrays the idea of a fleeting nightmare that one can't wake up from. The creature design in Bloodborne is especially impressive, featuring monsters who are consistently dramatic, surprising, and perplexing. Nowhere is the art design more striking than through the game's many excellently paced boss battles, featuring creatures that are almost ineffable, taking the most ethereal of H.P. Lovecraft's cryptic monster descriptions and making them a reality. What Miyazaki and his team were able to accomplish through Bloodborne's sheer excellence is truly awe-inspiring. The level of depth of the concepts being presented through every facet of the game design is second to none, making for one of my favorite video games of all time. It is an experience that is as cerebral as it is visceral, and will truly excite, disgust, frighten, exhilarate, and engross you in ways that only a masterfully concocted horror story can. It is easily my favorite game of 2015, and is definitely a must-play title for players who enjoy both intellectual and compulsory challenges that are nuanced and exciting. With that said, I hope that you all enjoyed my top 10 games of 2015. Be sure to leave a comment below letting me know your thoughts on these titles as well as your choices. I'm definitely interested in hearing what all of you thought of 2015 and the experiences that it provided. Thank you all for watching and listening, and now I will leave you with my top 3 handheld games of the year.